South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol will embark on a trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar this weekend to strengthen economic cooperation and discuss security amid the conflict in the Middle East. Amid U.S. President Joe Biden having reaffirmed unwavering support for Israel during his trip to that conflict zone, rage and protests against Israel have grown throughout the Middle East and beyond following the explosion at a Gaza hospital the previous day. The nation's central bank stood pat on its current key rate, maintaining it at 3.5% for the sixth session to keep the economy afloat against widening financial and geopolitical risks. It's October 19, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol will embark on a trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar to strengthen economic cooperation and discuss security amid the conflict in the Middle East. He will be the first South Korean leader to make an official visit to those countries. Our correspondent Oh Soo-young has a preview.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will seek broader economic ties with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and discuss efforts for regional stability amid the Israeli-Hamas conflict as he becomes the first Korean leader to make an official state visit to Riyadh and Doha. Yoon's office said the President and First Lady Kim Gon-hee will head to Saudi Arabia on Saturday for a 4-day stay. His official schedule begins Sunday with a bilateral summit and luncheon with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, followed by an investment forum with over 300 Korean and Saudi firms. Yoon will also visit academic institutions to promote further cooperation in the private sector and people-to-people exchanges and commemorate 50 years of Korea and Saudi cooperation in the construction sector. The South Korean leader will head to Doha on Tuesday and drop by the International Horticultural Exposition before holding bilateral talks on Wednesday with Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. He'll then attend the Korea-Qatar Business Forum before visiting the country's education city. As Yoon's 6-day trip to the Middle East comes amid concerns that the Israeli-Hamas conflict could result in broader clashes in the Gulf region. Yoon's Deputy National Security Advisor said regional security will be high on the agenda during Yoon's summits with the Saudi and Qatari leaders.
Through this trip, we hope to strengthen practical cooperation with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, while also discussing ways to achieve peace in the Middle East and strengthen our own security. The trip is also meaningful in that, as a global pivotal state, South Korea will contribute to discussions on challenges facing the international community.
Also amid concerns of North Korea cooperating with actors like Hamas, Iran and Russia, a senior Yoon official said the president could well raise the issue in this bilateral summit, as Ho seeks greater support in clamping down on Pyongyang's illegal weapons cooperation and evasion of global sanctions. More than anything, the key feature of Yoon's trip will be his economic diplomacy drive, expanding the scope of bilateral business relations from energy and construction to diverse new industries.
38% of our crude oil imports and 21% of our gas imports come from both those countries. As Saudi Arabia and Qatar prepare for the post-oil era, it's time for us to explore new partnerships. More than 70% of the economic delegation will be small and medium-sized companies whose industries are diverse, covering energy and construction, as well as digital, finance, medical and cultural content.
The president will be accompanied by 130 Korean corporate chiefs, including the leaders of Samsung, Hyundai Motor and Hana, to Saudi Arabia, and nearly 60 business leaders to Qatar. This comes as South Korean construction and shipbuilding firms look to procure big contracts in constructing Saudi's Neom megacity and building LNG carriers for Qatar. Beyond business ties, the top office says Seoul will also look to increase cooperation and exchanges in education, culture and tourism as the countries forge future-oriented relations going forward. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
President Biden wrapped up his trip to Israel, having reaffirmed unwavering support for that conflict zone while working to let humanitarian aid move into Gaza through the border with Egypt. But protests grow in the Arab world over yesterday's deadly hospital explosion in Gaza. Our E&E has analyzed the outcome of this high-stakes trip.
U.S. President Joe Biden concluded his visit to Israel on Wednesday, which had the goal of demonstrating support for Israel while reducing the chances of a broader conflict and also ensuring that he was fully attentive to the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Following the cancellation of a previously scheduled summit in Jordan, President Biden departed the region without any in-person meetings with Arab leaders.
Biden's visit to Israel accomplished two things. The first one is it did seem through his conversations with the Egyptian president, Sisi, to open up a corridor for humanitarian goods to flow into Gaza, which I think is a really important accomplishment, at least in the short term. Obviously, this is just a Band-Aid on a much larger wound, but it's certainly better than what we had before.
While flying back to Washington, Mr. Biden talked to Egyptian President El-Sisi, who agreed to reopen the border with Gaza and let 20 humanitarian aid trucks through. The U.S. leader said he wanted to make sure this could happen quickly, and he praised El-Sisi for being very cooperative. Another possible outcome is that Biden's discussions in the region and Washington's defense and State Departments deter the conflict from broadening and encompassing potentially Hezbollah or Iran or other actors. In this regard, his visit seems to have helped ease tensions to some degree.
The other thing I think that's important outcome of this is that the Biden administration does seem to have decided, and probably this helps push it forward, to ask Congress for several $1 billion in aid that's going to be combined for an aid package for Israel and Ukraine to go along with a $100 million aid package, which has been announced to go into Gaza and the West Bank.
Amid the tensions in Arab nations after the hospital blast in Gaza, there are conflicting claims about who was behind it. Biden said data from his Defense Department showed that the explosion was not likely to have been caused by an airstrike by the Israeli military. But there are conflicting views as to whether Biden's visit has done anything to help an already inflamed region. The anger there is rumble on regardless, with each side looking to place blame at the door of others. Yoon-hee, Arirang News.
Following the explosion at a Gaza hospital, rage and protests against Israel grow throughout the Middle East and North Africa. In Europe, the conflict has triggered hate crimes and threats of terrorism targeting Jews. Lee Eun-jin has more.
Following the deadly blast on Tuesday night on a hospital in the Gaza Strip that killed nearly 500 people, a former Hamas leader called for a worldwide day of rage. And thousands of people have rallied in countries across the Middle East and North Africa to protest. On Wednesday, demonstrators gathered outside U.S. embassies. As the Jordanian government declared 3 days of mourning, thousands of people gathered outside the U.S. and Israeli embassies, where Islamic parties in the country called for a general strike. In the Lebanese capital, Beirut, protesters clashed with security forces who used water cannons to disperse crowds close to the U.S. embassy. Overnight, demonstrations also took place in Turkey, Morocco, Libya, and Iran. Meanwhile, the conflict between Israel and Hamas is causing reverberations throughout Europe, from demonstrations to hate crimes and terrorist attacks. Early on Wednesday morning, 2 hooded men threw Molotov cocktails at a synagogue and a Jewish community center in central Berlin. Local police said there were no reports of injuries or damage.
They said this night they would try to burn the building. There were 2 Molotov cocktails thrown on the building at around 4 o'clock in the morning. So nothing happened. The bottles apparently didn't reach the building.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is currently in Egypt after visiting Israel on Tuesday, condemned the attacks and said anti-Semitism has no place in Germany.
It is completely clear that we do not accept this and will never accept it when Jewish institutions are attacked, and that events and activities which turn violent or use anti-Semitic slogans will not be accepted.
Meanwhile, in France, several airports were evacuated on Wednesday after receiving emails containing threats of attack. And following Monday's deaths of 2 Swedish citizens in a stabbing in Brussels, the leaders of Belgium and Sweden met on Wednesday with the EU's chief executive to discuss the security gap in the bloc's management of migration and asylum. The attack in Brussels was allegedly carried out by a Tunisian national who was in the country illegally after an asylum application was rejected in 2020.
One specific dimension relates to individuals who are considered a security threat and have received a return order. Currently, they can be asked to leave voluntarily. We must urgently change this.
Von der Leyen said the bloc's next migration pact would help avoid such situations by allowing state authorities to more quickly deport foreigners who are deemed a threat to national security. 이은진, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has decided to provide humanitarian assistance worth $2 million to help those affected by the war between Israel and Hamas. The Foreign Ministry announced Thursday that it will closely consult with relevant entities to ensure the assistance is used for humanitarian purposes. It also expressed deep concerns about the rapidly increasing number of civilian casualties in the region, adding South Korea will work together with the international community to end the conflict and casualties. It also urged parties to comply with international humanitarian law and take measures to protect civilians. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is on a two-day visit to Pyongyang that started on Wednesday. His trip coincides with a summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin during the Third Belt and Road Forum held in Beijing. Lavrov will likely discuss the implementation of agreements made during the recent summit between Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, as well as the Russian president's anticipated visit to North Korea. After Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu's visit to the north in July and Kim's trip to Russia last month, high-level exchanges between the two countries seem to be increasing. The U.S. Air Force unveiled the landing of the B-52 strategic bomber at a Cheongju Air Base to the media today. It's the first time that the bomber landed at a South Korean air base. Speaking to the press on Thursday, the U.S. Air Force said the deployment of the B-52 to the Korean peninsula is incredibly important in showing U.S. commitment to the defense of South Korea. It also explained that the B-52 mission demonstrates that Washington stands by its allies and that it has an ironclad commitment to secure peace and stability in the region. Meanwhile, the Joint Chief of Staff stressed that it is part of U.S. efforts to increase the regular visibility of strategic assets on the peninsula. The Bank of Korea holds its key interests rate steady at 3.5% again as economic recovery remains its top priority. This is despite concerns over inflation and oil price hikes due to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Our economic correspondent Shin Ha-young has the details.
The Bank of Korea has again held the country's key interest rate steady at 3.5%. The decision was announced on Thursday following a Monetary Policy Committee meeting.
Uncertainty over inflation and economic growth increased due to prolonged monetary tightening in major countries and rising geopolitical risks. It is expected that the easing of the inflation rate will be more gradual than initially expected. Considering such factors, we have decided to keep a tightened monetary policy. The Board of Governors voted unanimously to maintain the current tightened stance.
This is the sixth consecutive time that the BOK has decided to keep their rate unchanged. The base rate has been held at 3.5% since February, following 10 consecutive rate hikes aimed at taming inflation beginning in August 2021. Analysts say uncertainty about economic recovery was the main factor behind the decision, as aggressive rate hikes could further hinder economic growth. While there are signs of a rebound in exports, a downturn in consumer spending is raising uncertainty about the country's economic recovery. Inflationary pressure, soaring household debt, and the exchange rate market are factors hindering the BOK from cutting rates. The governor of the BOK said at a press conference that the pace of inflation decline may not be as fast as the bank predicted in August. 2 months ago, the bank forecasted this year's consumer price growth at 3.5% and next year's at 2.4%. Regarding the impact of the Israel-Hamas conflict on global financial markets, he said it's raising economic uncertainty, but it's difficult to make any sort of prediction. He also added that the U.S. benchmark interest rate would be affected by the volatility in global oil prices. On the back of the BOK's latest decision, the rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. still stands at 2 percentage points.
If the U.S. is continuing to signal that it may raise the interest rates, I think it's much too early right now for Bank of Korea to signal that they are going to lower the rates or even they are not going to raise rates any further.
The Bank of Korea says that most committee members think it's necessary to consider rate hikes due to rising inflationary pressure. On the other hand, the need for flexibility in both rate hikes and cuts was also raised during a time of growing economic uncertainty. 신하영, Arirang News.
The Korean government vows to bolster the medical system for areas outside the capital, often marginalized when it comes to critical health services. Eyes are now on the government's push to increase the quota at medical schools, against which doctors' groups oppose. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The government is making structural reforms in the medical infrastructure system to make sure non-urban and rural areas receive quality services in essential fields. President Yoon Suk-yeol acknowledged the severity of the situation on Thursday, noting certain areas were being neglected with regard to essential medical services as rural hospitals are unable to compete with large private hospitals in Seoul.
국민 건강과 생명에 직결된 지역 필수 의료가 붕괴되고 있습니다. 소아 청소년과 산부인과 같은 필수 진료 과목의 인력 수급이 어려워 적기에 치료를 받지 못하는 국민들이 많습니다. 또 지역 간 의료 격차 문제도 심각한 수준에 이르렀습니다.
The comments came at a strategy meeting on essential medical innovation at Chungbuk National University, where Yoon met with directors of National University hospitals to discuss how to tackle this issue. As part of President Yoon's plan, these National University hospitals scattered across the country will be fostered as core providers of essential health services under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Health and Welfare. They were previously under the Education Ministry. Another key issue for the government at the moment is to expand the number of students accepted annually at medical schools. Over the past 18 years, South Korea has kept the number of newly accepted students at 3,058. The government, citing that the OECD average for the number of doctors per 1,000 people is 3.7, whereas in South Korea it is 2.6, said raising the cap was inevitable. However, this could come with a backlash, as the previous Moon Jae-in administration attempted to do the same thing, stirring up strong opposition from doctors. That said, President Yoon has taken a cautious approach while acknowledging the need to increase the number of doctors. Other measures will support the changes.
산부인과, 소아과 등 필수 분야에 인력이 유입될 수 있도록 법적 리스크 부담을 완화하고 보험 수가를 조정하고 보상 체계의 개편이 아울러서 뒷받침되어야 합니다.
President Yoon added that medical restructuring was ultimately for the people, as the country's number one purpose is to protect their lives. The president also sees this issue as one of balancing regional growth, saying the lack of quality medical services in suburban and rural areas was why people were not moving into them. Additionally, the matter is directly related to the nation's economic growth. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The latest efforts to reduce the carbon footprint are coming from the European Union. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. A transitional period had begun this month for countries exporting goods to the EU, with South Korea being no exception. I want to bring in our trade correspondent Moon Hae-ryun to talk about this issue. Welcome, Hae-ryun.
Good evening, Jung-min.
Evening. And so what exactly is CBAM, and what does a transitional period involve?
Right, so simply put, CBAM is a measure to prevent something called carbon leakages. It's what happens when a company moves its production facilities from a country with strict carbon emission policies to one with policies that are a bit more lax. With CBAM, production facilities based outside of the EU will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as sites within the bloc. The current system used in the EU is called ETS, the Emissions Trading System. South Korea was the second country in the world to implement it, so it's something we're familiar with. It's a cap-and-trade system where companies can buy allowances within a certain limit to account for their emissions. Any allowances that aren't used can be sold to other companies. The new CBAM mechanism will subject all companies importing goods into the EU to this system. But companies don't need to worry about this just yet. From the beginning of this month up until the end of 2025, only greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported, and that's without needing to make any financial payments. The first reporting period is until the end of January next year. So far, no companies in South Korea have submitted their reports. But from 2026, importers will need to declare the quantity of goods being brought into the EU in the preceding year, as well as what's called their embedded greenhouse gas emissions, which are greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production and transportation of goods. They will then have to surrender the relevant number of CBAM certificates priced at the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances.
And what does this mean for South Korean companies?
So for now, this only applies to companies producing 6 different goods that have been classified by the EU as carbon-intensive goods. These are cement, iron, steel, and aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected. According to government data, steel exports to the EU totaled nearly $4.5 billion last year, while aluminium exports came to $540 million. This is no small amount, but steel and aluminium exports are predicted to drop by more than 1/5 as a result of CBAM. So why are exports expected to decline? A survey showed that more than half of South Korean companies who exported goods to the EU in the past and plan to do so in the future do not have any plans in place for CBAM. I spoke to an industry insider about the reasons behind this, and he gave 3. One is that the EU has not yet released detailed guidelines, so companies aren't able to fully prepare. Let's take a listen to the other 2 reasons.
Businesses with 30 to 40 employees have only 1 or 2 people that are in charge of dealing with carbon emissions. This means that they don't have the capacity to prepare for new situations like this. Another reason is that there are a lot of companies that lack knowledge or capacity for an organized MRV system.
So what is the MRV mechanism he just mentioned? And if the companies are feeling unprepared, what about the Korean government?
So MRV actually stands for Measure, Report and Verify, and it's actually a key component of the government's response plan to CBAM. Think of the MRV as a basic tool to report carbon emissions. The government plans to provide funding to SMEs so they can implement it and expand consulting for employees about MRV. In an emergency economic meeting earlier this week, Finance Minister Chu had something to say about this.
We will consult with the EU to recognise domestic emissions costs. In addition, we will actively support technology development and facility investment to reduce carbon emissions for export items to the EU, such as hydrogen-reduced steel.
So far, the government has been busy preparing for the transitional period. In addition to forming a dedicated task force, local companies can use the current domestic emission calculation system to report to the EU until the end of 2025. The government also plans to open further negotiations with the Taxation and Customs Union of the EU next month, so we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Right, we will have to keep our eyes on it. Thanks for the report, Hye-yeon.
My pleasure.
Rain clouds are currently stretched out horizontally across Chungcheongdo and Gangwon-do provinces. These rain clouds will be moving down towards the south of the country overnight. Rain has subsided for northern central regions, but the rest of the country has some lingering showers. Chungcheongdo and Gyeongsang-bukdo provinces will see 5 to 40 millimeters. Jeollabuk-do 5 to 30. The surrounding regions will see up to 20 millimeters of rainfall. Keep in mind that unstable atmospheric conditions will produce thunder and lightning at times. Behind the rain clouds are a group of cold air masses. Tomorrow's central regions, including Seoul, will see lows in single figures. By Saturday, colder mornings are expected with lows of only 5 degrees Celsius. We'll see wide variation in morning temperatures across the nation. Lows range from 8 to 15 degrees nationwide. By the daytime, more sunshine will prevail. Highs in Seoul will get up to 14 degrees, Gwangju 17, Daegu and Gyeongju will be topping out at 18 degrees. For this weekend, early winter-like conditions are expected here in Seoul, and clear skies are expected after rainfall. That's all for now, and to the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.